"Marry me for 1 year," the billionaire said quietly, sliding a contract across the table, "and I'll save your mother's life." Clara Bennett never imagined the moment that would change her future would happen on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Manhattan. Outside the cafe window, cold March rain slid down the glass like slow tears, blurring the city lights and the yellow taxis passing along Lexington Avenue. Inside, the room smelled of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries, the kind of cozy place where people usually talked about weekend plans, not life-altering bargains. Clara sat frozen in the small wooden chair, staring at the document in front of her. The paper looked ordinary, crisp white with neat black print, but the words felt heavier than anything she had ever held. Across from her sat Daniel Whitmore, the man whose name had appeared in business magazines for years, the 35-year-old tech billionaire who had built Whitmore Systems into one of the fastest-growing companies in the country. Up close, he didn't look like the ruthless CEO the headlines described. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his dark hair neatly styled, and his calm gray eyes watched her with a patience that made Clara's heart pound even harder. "You don't have to decide immediately," Daniel said, his voice steady, almost gentle. "But the hospital needs payment by Friday." Clara lowered her gaze back to the contract. The words blurred for a moment before her eyes focused again. 1 year. A marriage in name only. Public appearances. Confidentiality. At the bottom of the page waited a clean line for her signature. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed them against the table to steady herself. Just 3 days earlier, she had been standing beside her mother's hospital bed, listening as the doctor explained the cost of the surgery that might save her life. The number had sounded impossible, something that belonged in a corporate budget, not the reality of a 26-year-old art teacher who worked 2 jobs just to cover rent. Clara remembered the quiet smile her mother had given her that night, the same gentle smile she had worn throughout Clara's childhood, even when money was tight and the future uncertain. "Don't worry about me," her mother had whispered. But Clara did worry. She worried every single minute. That was why she was here now, sitting across from a billionaire with a contract that could change everything. Daniel folded his hands calmly. "This arrangement helps both of us," he explained. "My company is negotiating a major merger. Investors prefer stability. A married CEO looks dependable." Clara let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though nothing about the situation was funny. "So I'm part of your public image." "You'd be my wife," Daniel corrected quietly. "Legally. Publicly. For 12 months. The rain tapped gently against the window. Clara stared at the line, waiting for her name. Somewhere across the city, machines beeped softly beside her mother's hospital bed. Somewhere a clock was counting down to Friday. Her chest tightened as a single tear slipped down her cheek and landed on the contract, leaving a small dark circle in the paper. For a moment, she wondered if this was the exact second when a life could turn in a completely different direction. Then Clara Bennett picked up the pen, took a slow breath, and signed her name. Clara Bennett did not remember leaving the cafe that afternoon. Only the sound of the rain and the quiet way Daniel Whitmore had stood to pull out her chair as if they had just finished a polite business meeting instead of rewriting the direction of 2 lives. The contract rested inside her worn canvas bag, heavier than the sketchbooks she usually carried, and as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool March air brushed against her face like a wake-up call. Manhattan moved around her the way it always did. Taxis rushing past, people hurrying beneath umbrellas, the smell of roasted nuts drifting from a nearby street cart, but everything felt strangely distant. 20 minutes later, she pushed open the glass doors of Westbrook Medical Center, and the familiar scent of antiseptic and polished floors wrapped around her. Clara walked down the quiet hallway toward room 312, her shoes soft against the tile, each step echoing the decision she had just made. Inside the room, her mother lay propped against a stack of pillows, a pale blue hospital blanket folded neatly across her legs. The late afternoon sunlight slipped through the blinds and painted thin stripes across the walls. Her mother smiled the moment she saw her. It was the same warm smile that had comforted Clara her entire life, even now when exhaustion lingered in her gentle brown eyes. "You look tired," her mother said softly. Clara set her bag down and sat beside the bed, carefully brushing a strand of silver hair away from her mother's forehead. "Just a long day," she replied, forcing a small smile of her own. She did not mention the billionaire, the contract, or the strange future waiting beyond Friday. For a moment, she simply held her mother's hand and listened to the quiet rhythm of the heart monitor beside the bed. The doctor had been clear that morning. Without the surgery scheduled for the end of the week, her mother's condition would continue to worsen. Clara had spent the last 3 nights calculating every possible option, selling old furniture online, calling distant relatives, even considering a third job she knew she could not physically manage. None of it had come close to the amount the hospital required. Until today, Clara inhaled slowly and opened her bag. The contract paper rustled softly as she slid it out, careful not to unfold the pages completely. Her signature rested at the bottom like proof of something unreal. 1 year of marriage to a man she barely knew. 12 months of pretending to belong in a world filled with penthouses, charity galas, and investors who read financial reports over breakfast. She closed her eyes for a moment, wondering if she had just traded her freedom for security. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore was probably already returning to a glass tower office overlooking the Hudson River, discussing billion-dollar mergers with executives who had never worried about hospital bills or overdue rent. Their lives could not have been more different. Yet somehow those lives were now connected by a simple line of ink. Her mother squeezed her hand gently, drawing Clara back to the present. "Whatever is weighing on your mind," she said quietly, "remember that life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." Clara glanced down at the folded contract again and felt her heart beat faster. For the first time since leaving the cafe, she realized that in less than 48 hours, she would not just be Clara Bennett anymore. She would be Clara Whitmore, the wife of one of the most powerful men in New York, and the thought was both terrifying and impossible to fully believe. 2 mornings later, Clara Bennett stood in front of a tall mirror inside a quiet bridal suite on the top floor of the Whitmore estate, staring at a reflection that felt strangely unfamiliar. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows overlooking the Hudson River, illuminating the elegant white gown she had been helped into only minutes earlier. The fabric was soft and graceful, falling perfectly to the floor, nothing like the simple clothes she usually wore while teaching art classes or sketching in Central Park. Somewhere downstairs, musicians were rehearsing a gentle string melody, and the distant clink of glassware drifted upward as staff prepared for the ceremony. Clara lifted her hand slowly and touched the delicate sleeve of the dress, half expecting the entire scene to dissolve like a dream. Less than 48 hours ago, she had been sitting beside her mother in a hospital room, wondering how she would possibly find the money for the surgery scheduled later that afternoon. Now the surgery had been approved, the hospital bill already covered, and the world around her had transformed into something straight out of a magazine she had only ever flipped through in waiting rooms. A soft knock sounded at the door before it opened gently, and a calm voice spoke from behind her. "Everything is ready whenever you are." Clara turned and saw Daniel Whitmore standing near the doorway, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that made him look every bit the powerful businessman the newspapers described. Yet his expression remained quiet and composed, the same thoughtful calm she had noticed when they first met in the cafe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them did not feel uncomfortable, only unfamiliar, as if both were still adjusting to the strange reality unfolding around them. Clara finally broke the quiet with a small breath. "I still cannot believe this is actually happening." Daniel glanced toward the window where sunlight glimmered across the river. "It will be simple," he said evenly. "The ceremony will last about 10 minutes. After that, there will be a reception for the investors and the press. Everything has been arranged to look natural." Clara nodded slowly. She understood the purpose of today. To the outside world, this was the romantic wedding of a successful entrepreneur and the woman he loved. Photographers would capture smiling moments. Reporters would describe the event as elegant and heartfelt, and no one would know that the entire marriage had been decided with a pen and a contract. She looked down at the simple ring resting on the small velvet tray beside the mirror. The band was understated but beautiful, a thin circle of platinum that reflected the morning light. For a brief second, Clara wondered what people would think if they knew the truth behind it. Daniel stepped a little closer, but kept a respectful distance. "If you want to walk away now," he said quietly, "I will understand." Clara blinked in surprise. "You would cancel everything after paying for my mother's surgery?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "This arrangement only works if you choose it freely. Clara studied his face carefully. For someone who had built a billion-dollar company, he did not look controlling or impatient. Instead, there was something steady in his voice, something that made her realize he meant what he said. She turned back toward the mirror and took one slow breath. Then she picked up the ring and slipped it gently onto her finger. The cool metal rested against her skin like a silent promise. When Clara finally looked back at Daniel, her voice was calm but determined. "Let us finish what we started." Downstairs the music began to play, and for the first time since signing the contract, Clara Bennett stepped forward to become Clara Whitmore. The ceremony lasted exactly 11 minutes, yet to Clara it felt like time moved in slow motion. The garden behind the Whitmore estate stretched toward the river in perfect symmetry, trimmed hedges lining a stone walkway where white chairs had been arranged in elegant rows. Soft music drifted through the air as guests murmured politely beneath the bright afternoon sun. Investors, executives, and members of the press filled the seats, all dressed in tailored suits and graceful dresses, their quiet conversations carrying the unmistakable tone of wealth and influence. Cameras waited patiently near the aisle, ready to capture the moment when Daniel Whitmore, one of the most powerful technology executives in New York, married the woman who until 2 days ago had lived in a small rented apartment above a grocery store in Queens. Clara walked slowly beside him as the officiant spoke, her heart beating so loudly she wondered if the microphones hidden among the flowers might capture it. Daniel's posture remained calm and confident, the same composed presence he carried in business meetings, yet when their eyes met briefly, she noticed something softer there, a quiet awareness that the entire moment was carefully constructed for the watching world. The vows were simple, traditional, and delivered with respectful sincerity. When the officiant asked if Daniel Whitmore took Clara Bennett to be his wife, he answered clearly without hesitation. When Clara repeated the words that followed, her voice remained steady even though the meaning behind them felt complicated and fragile. The platinum rings exchanged between them gleamed in the sunlight as applause rose politely from the guests. Somewhere nearby, a photographer whispered instructions while another camera flashed. To the outside world, the scene looked flawless, the beginning of a modern fairy tale between a billionaire entrepreneur and a graceful young woman who had captured his heart. Only the two of them understood that the truth was far more complicated. The reception afterward unfolded in the grand ballroom of the estate, where tall windows revealed the Hudson River glowing under the late afternoon light. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen stars, while servers moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and carefully prepared appetizers. Clara stood beside Daniel as he greeted investors and board members, each handshake accompanied by polite congratulations and curious glances toward his new bride. She listened quietly as business leaders discussed company expansions and upcoming mergers as casually as if they were discussing weekend plans. It felt like standing inside a completely different universe from the small classrooms and art studios that had filled her life only days earlier. Yet Daniel never rushed her through the introductions. Each time someone approached, he spoke her name clearly and with calm respect. Hours later, as the last guests began to leave and the golden light outside faded into evening, the estate finally grew quiet. The music stopped and the ballroom lights dimmed while staff cleared away the remaining glasses. Clara found herself standing alone near one of the tall windows, staring out at the darkening river while the reality of the day slowly settled over her. She was married now, legally and publicly tied to a man she had met less than 3 days ago. Footsteps approached softly behind her before Daniel's calm voice broke the silence. "You handled today better than most people would." Clara turned toward him, her expression thoughtful and a little overwhelmed. "I still feel like I am acting in someone else's life." Daniel studied her for a moment before gesturing toward the quiet hallway that led upstairs. "There's one more part of today we should not ignore." Clara followed his gaze toward the staircase that led to the private wing of the estate. The realization came slowly but clearly. The celebration was over. The guests were gone. And for the first time since signing the contract, there were no cameras, no investors, and no carefully staged smiles. Only two strangers who had just become husband and wife. The quiet hallway of the Whitmore estate felt completely different from the grand ballroom only minutes earlier. The music had faded, the laughter of guests was gone, and the house now rested in a calm evening silence broken only by the soft ticking of a distant clock. Clara walked beside Daniel toward the private wing of the estate, the gentle echo of their footsteps following them across the polished wooden floor. A tall window at the end of the corridor revealed the dark surface of the Hudson River reflecting the distant lights of the city. For the first time since the ceremony began that afternoon, there were no cameras, no reporters, and no audience watching their every movement. Daniel opened a door at the end of the hall and stepped aside to let Clara enter first. The room beyond was spacious and warm, illuminated by soft lamps placed beside a large bed and two comfortable armchairs near the window. Everything about the room was elegant but calm, far from the loud glamour of the reception downstairs. Clara paused just inside the doorway and looked around slowly. The reality of the moment finally settled over her shoulders like the quiet evening air. This was the room where she and Daniel were expected to begin their first night as husband and wife. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel closed the door gently behind them and removed his jacket, placing it neatly across the back of a chair. Clara stood near the window, her hands resting lightly on the fabric of her wedding dress, watching the city lights shimmer across the water outside. She felt strangely calm and nervous at the same time, as if the entire day had finally slowed enough for her thoughts to catch up. Daniel stepped closer but kept a respectful distance between them. "You should know something," he said quietly. Clara turned toward him with a curious expression. "This marriage may exist because of a contract, but that does not mean you should ever feel uncomfortable in this house." His tone was steady and sincere, the same calm voice she had heard when he offered to cancel the wedding earlier that morning. Clara studied his face for a moment, trying to understand the man she had married only hours ago. "I appreciate that," she replied softly. "Everything today has felt like a performance." Daniel nodded slightly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "The world expects certain appearances," he said. "But appearances are not the same as reality." Clara walked slowly toward the small sofa near the window and sat down, carefully smoothing the folds of her dress. The platinum ring on her finger caught the light again, reminding her how quickly her life had changed. Daniel remained standing for a moment before finally taking a seat in the armchair across from her. The quiet space between them felt thoughtful rather than awkward, like two strangers trying to understand a new chapter neither of them had planned. After a long moment, Clara looked up at him again. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Daniel nodded. "Of course." She hesitated for only a second before speaking. "Why did you really choose me for this arrangement?" Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair, considering the question. "Because when we spoke in that cafe," he said slowly, "you never once asked about money. You only asked how quickly your mother could receive treatment." Clara lowered her gaze for a moment, remembering the desperation she had felt that day. Daniel continued quietly. "Most people in this city see opportunity first. You saw responsibility." The room fell silent again after his words. Clara felt an unexpected warmth in her chest, something softer than the fear she had carried all day. The distance between them no longer felt as wide as it had only minutes earlier. Daniel stood from his chair and walked toward the window where Clara was sitting. For a brief moment, he simply looked out at the river beside her before speaking again, his voice gentle and thoughtful. "You cried when you signed the contract," he said quietly. Clara nodded without looking at him. "Because I thought I was giving up something important." Daniel turned toward her. Then, his expression calm but sincere. "Sometimes," he said softly, "life surprises us after the decision is made." Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for meaning. In that quiet moment, Daniel reached out gently, lifting her hand where the platinum ring rested, and before Clara could fully understand what he intended, he leaned forward and kissed her softly. The gesture was simple, respectful, and completely unexpected, yet the quiet sincerity behind it carried something real. When Daniel stepped back again, the silence between them felt different than before, warmer somehow, as if the carefully written contract had just become a little less powerful than the moment they had shared. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate the next day, painting soft golden patterns across the polished floor of the kitchen. Clara Bennett stood quietly near the wide marble counter, holding a warm mug of coffee with both hands while she watched the early light reflect across the Hudson River outside. The events of the previous night replayed gently in her mind, especially the quiet moment by the window when Daniel had unexpectedly kissed her. It had not been dramatic or overwhelming, yet the sincerity behind it had left an impression she could not easily explain. Clara had expected their marriage to feel distant and formal, something maintained only by rules written on paper, but the memory of that simple gesture had introduced a quiet uncertainty into the arrangement they had agreed upon. Across the large kitchen island, Daniel Whitmore sat with a tablet in front of him, reviewing reports that had likely arrived before sunrise. Even in the calm of the early morning, he carried the composed focus of someone responsible for thousands of employees and billions of dollars in decisions. Yet when he looked up and noticed Clara watching the river, he placed the tablet aside, without hesitation. "Did you sleep well?" he asked gently. Clara nodded slowly, though the truth was that her thoughts had kept her awake longer than usual. "Better than I expected," she answered honestly. The kitchen remained peaceful, the only sounds coming from the quiet hum of the coffee machine and the distant cry of a gull outside the window. Clara walked toward the large table where Daniel sat and noticed a small folder resting beside his tablet. Daniel followed her gaze and slid the folder across the table toward her. "These are the details for the hospital," he explained calmly. Clara opened the folder and immediately recognized the hospital letterhead printed at the top of the documents. Her eyes moved quickly across the pages until she reached the final line, confirming that the full cost of her mother's surgery and recovery had already been covered. Clara felt her chest tighten with relief and gratitude so strong that for a moment she could not speak. "The procedure went well last night," Daniel added quietly. "The surgeon called early this morning." Clara looked up at him, surprised. "You spoke with the hospital?" Daniel nodded once, only to make sure everything went smoothly. Clara closed the folder slowly and rested her hand against it. For days she had carried a constant fear that something might go wrong, that the surgery might be delayed or canceled if the payment did not arrive in time. Now that fear had quietly disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace she had not felt in weeks. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel met her eyes, but did not treat the moment as something extraordinary. "That was part of the agreement," he replied simply. Clara understood the logic of his answer, yet something about the way he had handled everything made the situation feel less like a cold transaction and more like genuine care. The quiet morning stretched gently around them as sunlight continued to brighten the room. After a moment, Daniel stood from his chair and walked toward the window beside her. "Today will be quieter than yesterday," he said. "No press, no investors, just a few meetings in the afternoon." Clara watched the river for another moment before turning toward him with a small, thoughtful smile. "Then maybe today we can learn how two strangers are supposed to live in the same house for a year." Daniel considered her words before giving a faint smile of his own. "That sounds like a reasonable first step." As the two of them stood there together watching the bright morning lights spread across the water, neither of them fully realized that the careful distance written into their contract had already begun to fade, replaced slowly by something far less predictable and far more real. 3 days after the wedding, the rhythm of life inside the Whitmore estate had begun to settle into something surprisingly calm. Clara Bennett now woke each morning to the quiet view of the Hudson River stretching beyond the tall windows of the estate, a view so different from the narrow brick buildings she used to see outside her apartment in Queens. The house itself moved with an organized quietness, staff arriving early to prepare breakfast while the soft scent of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen. Yet despite the luxury surrounding her, Clara continued to move through the rooms with the same natural simplicity she had always carried. That morning she stood near the long kitchen counter arranging a small bowl of fruit while sunlight streamed across the marble surface. Daniel Whitmore entered the room a moment later, his sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms as he reviewed something on his phone before placing it down beside the coffee machine. For a man responsible for one of the most powerful technology companies in the country, he moved through the house with a calm routine that felt unexpectedly normal. "You woke early," he said as he poured himself a cup of coffee. Clara smiled faintly. "I used to wake up before 6 to catch the subway across Queens." "Old habits stay with you." Daniel leaned against the counter across from her. "You do not need to worry about subway schedules anymore." Clara laughed softly at that, though the sound carried a hint of disbelief. The truth was she was still adjusting to the idea that her life had changed so dramatically in less than a week. Just then the quiet peace of the morning shifted when Daniel's phone vibrated sharply against the counter. He glanced at the screen, and his expression tightened slightly before he answered the call. "Whitmore," he said calmly. Clara could not hear the voice on the other end, but she noticed the way Daniel's posture grew more serious as he listened. After a moment, he ended the call and remained silent for a few seconds, thinking. Clara watched him carefully. "Something wrong." Daniel looked up at her and chose his words carefully. "There is a board meeting this afternoon that was moved forward unexpectedly." Clara could tell from his tone that this was more than a simple scheduling change. "Is that unusual?" she asked. Daniel nodded slightly. "The company is finalizing a merger that will affect every investor in the room. Normally those meetings are planned weeks in advance." Clara leaned lightly against the counter, sensing the tension that had entered the morning. Daniel continued, his voice thoughtful. "Someone inside the company has been asking questions about my personal life." Clara felt a quiet chill run through her thoughts. "About the marriage?" Daniel met her eyes. "Yes." For the first time since signing the contract, Clara remembered the exact words written in its clauses. The agreement was supposed to remain confidential, hidden from the investors and board members who believed the wedding had been a natural step in Daniel's life. "Do they know about the contract?" she asked quietly. Daniel shook his head once. "Not yet." He paused before adding something that made the situation feel more serious. "But someone is trying to find out." The sunlight still filled the kitchen. The coffee still steamed gently in their cups, yet the calm morning suddenly felt fragile. Clara understood that their carefully arranged marriage had always existed partly for the public image of Daniel's company. If that image was questioned, everything could change quickly. Daniel looked toward the window for a moment before speaking again. "This might create complications for both of us." Clara folded her hands together thoughtfully. Only a few days earlier she had believed the contract between them was the most complicated part of her new life. Now she was beginning to understand that marrying a billionaire meant stepping into a world where even quiet mornings could suddenly turn into the beginning of a much larger storm. That afternoon, the glass tower of Whitmore Systems rose into the Manhattan skyline, like a monument to precision and control, its mirrored surface reflecting the bright blue sky, while traffic flowed steadily below along the busy avenues. Clara Bennett stepped out of the black sedan beside Daniel Whitmore and looked up at the building, realizing that this was the place where his decisions shaped the lives of thousands of employees and investors. The lobby doors opened automatically as they approached, revealing a wide marble floor, quiet fountains, and a reception desk staffed by professionals who greeted Daniel with immediate recognition. Conversations hushed slightly as he walked through the lobby beside his new wife, a detail Clara noticed even though no one spoke about it directly. Daniel moved with the calm confidence of someone completely at home in this world, yet his attention remained quietly aware of Clara walking beside him. They entered a private elevator that carried them quickly upward through the building, the city shrinking below as the digital numbers climbed floor by floor. Clara watched the skyline spread across the windows, thinking about how far her life had traveled in only a few days. Daniel finally broke the silence as the elevator slowed near the executive floor. "The boardroom is expecting us," he said calmly. Clara nodded, though the weight of the moment was beginning to settle on her shoulders. When the doors opened, they stepped into a quiet hallway lined with glass offices where assistants and executives paused briefly to watch them pass. At the end of the corridor stood a set of large doors leading into the boardroom where the most important decisions of the company were made. Inside the room, a long polished table stretched across the floor, surrounded by investors, senior executives, and members of the board who had built their reputations in finance and technology. Conversations paused as Daniel entered, acknowledging each member with a calm greeting before guiding Clara to a seat beside him. At first, the discussion followed the expected agenda, presentations about financial projections, expansion plans, and the upcoming merger that had drawn international attention to Whitmore Systems. Clara listened quietly while charts appeared on large screens and executives explained strategies with confident voices. Yet beneath the professional discussion, she sensed an undercurrent of tension that had not been there before. Eventually, one of the board members leaned forward slightly, his expression measured but curious. "Before we proceed," he said. "There is a matter of clarification that concerns the stability of leadership." The room grew noticeably still. Daniel remained composed. "Go ahead." The man folded his hands calmly. "There have been rumors circulating about the circumstances surrounding your recent marriage." Clara felt a quiet wave of awareness move across the room as several investors exchanged glances. Daniel's posture did not change, but Clara could see that his attention sharpened immediately. "Rumors exist in every company," Daniel replied evenly. "That is not unusual." Another board member spoke next, her voice thoughtful. "The concern is whether those rumors could affect investor confidence during the merger." Clara understood what they were asking without hearing the exact words. They wanted reassurance that Daniel's personal life was stable, authentic, and not connected to any arrangement that might appear artificial to the public. The silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than expected. Daniel glanced briefly toward Clara, a quiet signal that he was weighing how to respond. In that moment, Clara realized that their private contract, signed quietly in a cafe only days earlier, had suddenly become something much larger than a personal agreement. It had become a question of trust, reputation, and leadership inside a billion-dollar company. The boardroom remained silent, every person waiting for Daniel Whitmore to speak, while Clara sat beside him knowing that whatever happened next could change far more than just the terms of a contract. The boardroom remained silent for several long seconds after the question was asked, the kind of silence that carried more weight than any argument. Clara Bennett felt the attention of every executive and investor in the room settle quietly on Daniel Whitmore as they waited for his answer. Through the tall windows behind the table, Manhattan stretched toward the horizon, sunlight reflecting across the glass towers of the city that Daniel had helped shape with his company. Yet inside the room the atmosphere felt carefully balanced, as if the next word spoken would determine far more than the outcome of a single meeting. Daniel rested his hands calmly on the polished table and looked around the room with the composed focus that had made him one of the most respected leaders in the technology industry. "You are asking whether my marriage is real," he said evenly. The board members exchanged brief glances, but no one interrupted him. Daniel continued with steady confidence. "The stability of this company has always depended on honesty with our investors and the people who trust us." He paused briefly before adding something that surprised several people in the room. "Yes, Clara and I signed a contract before we were married." A quiet ripple of reaction moved across the table, though Daniel did not allow the moment to grow dramatic. He continued speaking with the same calm tone. "The agreement was created because both of us needed help at a difficult moment in our lives. She needed medical care for her mother, and I needed to protect the company during an important merger." Clara felt her heart tighten as she listened, uncertain where his explanation would lead. Daniel turned slightly toward her before continuing his words to the entire room. "But contracts do not define everything that happens after they are signed." The boardroom remained completely still as he spoke the next sentence. "Somewhere between the wedding and today, I realized that Clara Bennett is not just part of an arrangement. She is someone I respect deeply and someone I care about." Clara looked at him in surprise, not because the words sounded rehearsed, but because they carried a sincerity she could clearly feel. Daniel then faced the board again. "If any investor believes that honesty weakens leadership, then I invite you to reconsider what kind of company we are building here." The silence that followed felt different now, less tense and more thoughtful. One of the senior board members leaned back slowly in his chair and nodded once. "Transparency has always been one of the strengths of this company," he said calmly. Another executive added quietly, and the merger numbers remained strong. Gradually the tension eased as the meeting returned to the agenda of financial reports and strategy discussions. Yet Clara knew something important had shifted. Daniel had not hidden the truth to protect his reputation. Instead, he had chosen honesty even when it risked criticism. An hour later the meeting concluded and the executives slowly gathered their papers and left the boardroom. When the last door closed behind them, Clara and Daniel remained seated beside each other at the long table. Clara looked at him carefully before speaking. "You did not have to say all of that." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Leadership is easier when the truth does not need to be hidden." Clara studied the man beside her and realized that the contract they had signed only days earlier had never predicted a moment like this. Daniel stood and offered his hand to help her up from the chair. As they walked together toward the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, the city stretched endlessly before them, full of possibilities neither of them had expected when they first met in that quiet cafe. And for the first time since their unusual marriage began, Clara Bennett understood that the future ahead of them might not be defined by a contract at all, but by the choices they would make together from that day forward.